Okay, I'm gonna get started in just a minute, and anybody who is joining will be able to download the handouts in the one of the tabs there, and this will be recorded also, so we'll be distributing it after. But thank you for joining, and we're going to be doing the first session in a series about including neurodiversity within existing neurodiversity initiatives. This session is going to be a beginning to your inclusion and is going to kind of be a foundational overview and how that might impact just those first steps of trying to include that. So, introduction, my name is Staci Andrews. I am the managing partner of Bennu Rise Consulting, and we specialize in talent acquisition. We also consult with a focus in diversity inclusion, specifically around mental health and neurodiversity. So I'm myself a neurodivergent professional, and I'm also a certified mental health peer specialist. So a lot of the work that I do around inclusion is based in mental health and neurodiversity. So our overview for today, we're going to start with a poll for the audience and then go into, and again, this handout can be accessed in the link in the attachments. And so I know it's helpful in the interest of inclusion to have a layout for those of us who are neurodiverse and some of us who aren't also. So we're going to go into what neurodiversity is, the common types. We're going to start with where we are today and the realities of the systems we operate within, including the clinical diagnoses and accommodations, and then moving into disability versus difference of ability and how neurodivergence is now being looked at. Some different aspects there about pioneers in the field and advocating for that change. And then rounding it out with the DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, if you can say that 3 times fast, and why that's actually really exciting and why I'm really excited to be here and the good news about that. And then I'm going to give you some information about the next session, what those topics are going to be, and how to contact me and Bennu Rise. So the first poll, we're going to be doing one poll today, and it's just going to be, see. What level of knowledge do you have of neurodiversity as a whole? And I know that's a really broad question, so whatever you feel comfortable with sharing, either A, very little or none, B, some but wanting to learn more, or C, high, operating within the neurodiversity movement currently. Awesome. B. So this particular series is geared towards the A and B. I know some of you who are watching either in the recording or going to be joining have a lot of knowledge of neurodiversity and even work in the space. And so it's a very foundational and basic beginning level knowledge. So I'm really excited to start and share with you. Thank you for participating. All right. So beginning with what is neurodiversity? The most common question I get when I say that's what I do. It's a few different things. We're going to be talking about it in the context of the movement to transition from the common known disability structure into the ideology that variations in the human brain are part of a standard variation. They're innately encompassing of different barriers and strengths and a different set of abilities than we've often looked at within especially organizational culture. So those terms are interchangeable: neurodiversity, neurodivergence, neurovariance, and those all refer to common variations in the human brain, usually in the context of sociability, learning, attention, and even mood and other mental functions. So those perceived variations, and perceived is a really important word we're going to get into later, of cognitive, affectual, and sensory functioning are differing from the majority of the general population. And that predominant neurotype that we refer to as neurotypical is just the majority of the population and how that's set up currently. So in short, all brain structures are simply different. The same way we all have different eye colors and different heights, and it's a morally neutral aspect to looking at how brain structures and people operate. A better way to say it, or a really good simplistic way to say it, is that neurodiversity refers to how different brains learn differently. It describes the highly diverse ways in which students learn, think, and process information. And students can be interchangeable for employees or individuals, just that people learn, think, and process. And I would add to that, communicate and present differently as well. So commonly, we're talking about these on the left side: ADHD, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and Tourette syndrome. Those are more of the common identified neurotypical types. But neurodiversity is moving over into this right side. It encompasses anxiety, depression, a lot of the mental health conditions that we talk about, oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, learning specific disorders, developmental disabilities, and even trauma. So it's not, I know this is very difficult to say about a neurodiverse population because we do want to have specifics, and these are some commonly referred to types, but ultimately it's going to encompass a lot more than what we can just spell out here. So that's important to remember. And we have to start with where we are today. We're not going to be able to change the world overnight. So we want to help implement and accommodate the existing structure. And we have to talk about what that is. And the current structure looks at, we're going to look at specifically autism spectrum disorder, which is only one of the primary types of neurodivergence, but it's helpful to delve into what that looks like today and where we're trying to go. So autism spectrum disorder, which will be annotated as ASD from here on, in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, the criteria is as follows: persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by the following currently or by history. And it lists some of the deficits. I'm not going to actually read those aloud. I have it here if you would like to. The reason I'm not going to is because none of them are actually deficits. They are all differences in display of social emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communicative behaviors. And so it's just important to look at the DSM-5 and that's the only current tool we have to assess and diagnose and additionally to treat what is known as mental disorders. So this is the structure that we're operating in right now, within a lot of those categories: ADHD, ASD, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. So we only have that criteria, and it only assesses the outward behavior of human behavior. And so even the conversation of diagnosis is dismissive to the whole picture, and we're aiming to separate neurodiversity from the disability framework into a new category, but we do have to acknowledge where we are and what tools we have at our disposal currently. So just because you see somebody communicating differently does not mean it's an actual deficit. And I think that's really important to note, while also noting the reality of where we are today. So on the note of the DSM-5 and diagnostic criteria, we've already seen some really specific examples of the way what was once categorized as a deficit or a disorder is now looked at in a completely different way. A really good one is when in 1973, homosexuality was removed from the DSM. That was prior to that time categorized as a mental disorder. And I think now we can all talk about LGBTQ rights and advocacy and equity, and that is a travesty to look at something as a deficit in that way, but that's where we were. And where we are today still, Asperger's syndrome was also within the DSM and removed in 1981. And that's another deep dive that we can get into at a later date. But Asperger's syndrome is no longer a terminology that is adequate or accurate. We don't use that, though you will hear it still used often. And all in all, the pathology, the cultural knowledge, and the political ideology around all of the diversity initiatives cannot be separated from the advocacy. The way that the world looks at and thinks about different groupings of people and different ways of moving through the world is an aspect of how we have to address and then move forward. So we can't ignore those barriers. I really love this. It's attributed to Einstein, though there is debate over whether or not it's actually him that said, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And that's a really good full circle way to look at neurodiversity and how we look at abilities versus strengths and weaknesses that we all have, just different. So in a fully developed structure, or the quintessential way of saying, in a perfect world, organizational culture would be inclusive and equitable to the degree that workplace accommodations become a standard part of employee support for everyone. Within our current structure, there are qualities that are currently viewed as necessary or lesser than within the workplace. So for that reason, being neurodiverse is a disability within many organizational landscapes. And because of that, there are accommodations that are needed. Some examples are time management, eye contact and social engagement, ability to organize tasks and schedule your own schedule, sensory needs, attention, and focus differentiations. So the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, defines disability as a physical or mental impairment substantially limiting one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. Again, we are operating within these definitions. Whether or not they need to be improved upon, we do have to acknowledge where we are. And so providing equity in this space means bringing all persons to a place where they are each able to focus on their individual strengths and abilities without being held back by their specific areas that they are not as strong in. The same way each player on a football team is given the specific role that best suits their strengths and abilities. Hi, Carol Jean. Thanks for joining. Great to have you. And if you're just now joining, the handout is attached in the slides, and we're also recording. So anything you missed can be accessed later. And yeah, so on the note of accommodations, it is the same concept as we don't say to a quarterback that they're not as good at catching as they are at throwing. That's their strength, and they might not be as good at something in the other parts of the team. So in a time when neurodiverse people are 80% in some research, depending on the category that you're looking at, more likely to be or underemployed, it's clear we still have to acknowledge these barriers within the common organizational structure. So when we're moving from disability into difference of ability, there's a few components there. And I really like to start with what's called Einstein syndrome, or as we know now, based on the category of the DSM, autism spectrum disorder may just be what Einstein syndrome is. This is a condition, and it's not in the DSM. It's more of a colloquial terminology that if a child experiences a late onset of language or late language emergence, and they also demonstrate giftedness in other areas of analytical thinking, a child with Einstein syndrome will eventually speak with no issues, but remains ahead of the curve in other areas. So it was named after Einstein, who, according to most biographers, was a late talker, didn't speak in full sentences till he was about 5 or 6, and was, I think, arguably one of the most impactful scientific contributors of his time. So it wasn't a stumbling block for him that he had these differences of communication. And it was coined by an American economist, Thomas Sowell, but basically that whole note on late talking can be a sign of what we consider autism spectrum disorder. And there's a significant percentage of children who are late talkers but thrive, proving themselves to be productive and highly analytical thinkers. I want to note here too that having late onset language emergence versus never being verbal are all in the range of the spectrum. Those aren't things that are they're not good, they're not bad. There's a difference in ability to communicate. So that's kind of what we're moving towards here. Within pioneers for neurodivergence, some of these people are openly diagnosed, and Charles Darwin was not at the time. The DSM was not in creation, but there are records that show, so starting with Bill Gates, he was considered incapable of learning and didn't finish. He was given an honorary degree from Harvard. He didn't actually finish at the university. And Charles Darwin has multiple historical records that say he avoided interaction socially. He was very quiet and isolated. He had alternative ways of communicating that he was more comfortable with, writing predominantly. And he had what we call special interests and hyperfixations on certain topics that were mostly STEM, what we now consider STEM, science and math areas. And Richard Branson, who is diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and dyslexia, dropped out of school when he was 15 and came around to the idea of neurodivergence before it was a movement, and saying that dyslexia was a brilliant way of thinking and that people with dyslexia have the skills of the future due to their vivid imaginations. So those are just 3 examples of people who moved through the world at a time when, diagnosed or not, they just operated differently than the people around them. So when we're moving from the structure that exists to the structure that we're advocating for, moving from diagnosis and disability to human-centered approaches that encompass a large population of individuals who have simply operated in a structure that was not made by the same brain type, has long asked individuals to adhere to a different set of strengths and barriers rather than embrace the differences in those areas. And I do want to note here, we're going to get more into it in the second session, not all categories of disability are variants in the same way. There is a separate category of disability that is separate from a spectrum and separate from the conversation about moving away from disability. So just a note there. And it's a much more, this is again kind of a 101 level introduction to the foundation of neurodiversity, but there's a much more nuanced conversation on the structural components that lead to certain qualities being viewed as disordered rather than a difference in strengths and weaknesses. So our primary goals in speaking with leaders and employees about neurodiversity in the workplace is to work within the reality of existing systems by acknowledging and becoming more knowledgeable about them, determine where and how we can implement policy, education, and accommodations, and ultimately to view each individual we come across for their unique abilities, while also being able to see that each person we encounter has areas in which they do not excel. So those are kind of the goals of what I try to do with organizations when we talk about what is this neurodiversity thing. So when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, those are kind of hot button words right now. And a lot of the time, we're not sure if we're really checking boxes or if we're doing the work. So I love the breakdown here of what that really means. Diversity asks who is in the room. Equity asks who's trying to get in the room but can't. What are the barriers? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard, respected, and understood? And that fourth component of belonging, which is sort of a new addition to the whole DEI world, is asking, is everyone feeling valued through positive connections and able to bring the authentic self to work? That is the primary goal, is to have each employee in organizations that we work with feel valued and feel like a major contributor, and that they get to be who they are when they go to work. So who benefits from inclusion other than everyone? The simple answer. So inclusivity of neurodiversity requires acknowledging the existing barriers that we spoke about, the innate strengths and weaknesses of all individuals. There are no individuals that have all the strengths and no weaknesses, and that we really miss the strengths when we focus solely on the barriers of one person. Neurodiversity is the secret ingredient for an innovative business, and when given the right tools, neurodivergent individuals can use their skills to achieve great things. There are some companies that are at the forefront of embracing neurodiversity and have statistically and scientifically noticed a shift in the mindset of their current staff, as well as their retention, their hiring abilities, and they've given people the power to not just disclose, but be a part of their organizational procedures. And so some of those companies that are great, and I can provide resources on this as well. SAP is a huge one, Microsoft, JP Morgan, Hewlett Packard, and Ernst & Young. And they have different varying programs for neurodiversity, as well as initiatives that they've implemented. So when we move back to the DEIB, I think probably everyone in here has seen, I just love the graphic that shows the difference between equality and equity, and a visual is good for my brain also. So providing equity means learning the differences and needs of each individual and allowing them to acquire the tools and support to help them function as their best self. Not giving everybody the same size box, not giving everybody the same accommodations or the same support, but looking at each individual for what they need so that we can all come to the same level and start from the beginning and start from where we are our best selves. And again, going into the belonging, from inclusion to belonging, you start with exclusion, and that's a lot easier to identify. But tolerance, where you're disliked, but you're allowed to be here, is sort of second. Acceptance, I accept you even though you're different. And the real goal is belonging. I embrace you for whoever you are. I want to hear your ideas. I want you to be a part of the process and a part of looking at where you bring strengths that I don't have, and vice versa. So I get really excited about this because that is all good news, because we're looking at, I love getting to speak with leaders and employees who are open to learning about neurodiversity, because it is exciting to revisit how we look at different brain types. It's not always a disability, and to be able to focus on the ways in which we thrive, that's a win for everyone. And providing true inclusion and belonging for employees allows individuals to operate at their best and most efficient level. It's a win for the organization and the team and the individuals working on those teams. So that looks different for everyone. Like we talked about with equity, not everybody sees work and success the same way, but we can only see somebody's true potential when they feel safe, heard, supported, and to elevate that, most importantly, they belong and are a part of the overall success of the team and the organization. Not just that they can be who they are and that's okay, but that they are actually an asset because of those differences. So we hear a lot about the Great Resignation and the levels of workplace burnout. I know I experienced both of those things, and I have a sense that, or the sense of belonging is a major factor in addressing those issues and creating spaces where employees enjoy coming to work and doing the work that they do, and that's a positive part of their life. That is the big shift here, that why we talk about neurodiversity and inclusion and belonging, is that in order to address why people are burnout and why we're seeing those trends, we have to first look at where they're coming from, and if there's a way to accommodate and make it where they can feel a sense of happiness and belonging and start to thrive in a workplace and not feel the need to just retreat. So this is session 1, the introduction. And again, for anybody who joined after or is watching this on the recording, the handout with all of these, the PowerPoint is attached. And session 2 is going to be some of the topics that will include the intersectionality in neurodiversity, mental health, which is the field that I came from initially, disability needs that we kind of alluded to that are outside variants that are within the disability model and should remain there, and other areas of diversity and ways in which they are intersectional with neurodiversity. And then we're going to look at more of the building of a specific toolbox of inclusivity and equity, learning style variances, all the way from attracting talent to having them in the workplace and continuing education, common workplace accommodations for neurodiversity, which, by the way, help a lot of people who are not identified or who are not neurodiverse. Building a toolbox for inclusive leaders, and participation by the very people that we are talking about. Having neurodiverse people, if there's something we used to say in the peer support world, nothing about us without us. So when it comes to creating initiatives, whether that's diversity of race, gender, demographic, neurodivergence, disability, including the very people that you are trying to support is essential. And we will delve more into that in the second session. But yeah, so this is my contact and connect info. I love this quote by Brene Brown: "Connection, along with love and belonging, is why we are here. It is what gives us purpose and meaning to our lives." So I appreciate each and every one of you for watching and being here and getting to share everything. Thank you, Carol Jean. And this is my contact info. If anybody wants to jot that down, if you have any questions or comments, I am open to connect. And I'm really appreciative of everybody being here based on this note. Love to connect with you all, and I hope to see you at the next session. Thanks, Mary. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Bruce. And I should go ahead and put these in the chat for you. In the interest of being inclusive, here is my contact information. All right. Well, thank you all for joining, and I'm going to leave this up for a little bit so that anybody can get it that needs it. And again, thank you so much for joining. It was great to have you all. I would love to do a more interactive model, so if anybody is open to that, let me know. This feels a lot like just being on stage, and I would much rather interact with everybody. But for the intro and the foundational information, I wanted to get it out there and move on from there. So this is interactive. I'm very open and would love to hear the feedback. Any topics that you think should be addressed or that you have questions about, please send me an email or a message through the website, and I'm excited to hear more from you then.